If all of you could backtrack a few months, before COVID-19 had us all stuck at home, how were you getting around? Now 10 or 15 years ago, most of you would have said taxi or car. But today the answers vary a bit more. You might be thinking Grab and Uber, public transport, and maybe even a shared bike. And this is what I want to discuss today: the urban citizen's journey from point A to point B. What does urban mobility look like right now? What are the challenges it faces? And what are the 5 big trends of the next 10 years? Now, as it stands, a few cities globally, like Amsterdam, Stockholm, Singapore, have highly effective mobility. And by effective, I mean it's affordable, it's accessible, safe, sustainable. In short, it's well-rounded. Now, over the past 10 years, a few factors that both you and I have seen have really changed the way mobility is today. And these factors, I find, can be categorized into 2 main mobility movements. And the first of these are tech-driven developments. Now take Google Maps, the Uber app, the Grab app, the shared mobility apps for the bike sharing. All of these are on our smartphones, and they're pieces of technology that are becoming so fundamental to mobility that we almost can't get around without them. And the second of these movements is alternate modes of transport. And when I say alternate, I mean anything other than the car. Biking, for example, has seen a huge resurgence. Amsterdam and Copenhagen boast 60% and 45% of home-to-work trips made by bike. Meanwhile, metro system growth nearly doubled over the past 10 years, with many Asia-Pacific cities pioneering. Now, despite these 2 major movements, urban mobility still faces 4 primary challenges: pollution, congestion, the economic impact, and of course safety issues. Now, each of these problems are intertwined, but they're heavily rooted in a few factors. Now, the most significant of these, as I'm sure you can all guess, is the car. Now, instead of boring you with a bunch of statistics on the inefficiency and the lacking factors of mobility, all I can say is that whether we like it or not, these challenges will always remain at some level. But cities like Singapore, Stockholm, Amsterdam, and a few others show that it's actually possible to move beyond these problems and move into an effective and efficient mobility system. Now, to reach this effective and efficient mobility system, I find that there's going to be 5 major game changers of future mobility that's going to, in a way, revolutionize the way we get around. The first of these trends is the freedom of choice. The freedom for you and I to choose whether we take public transport, whether we take a bike, whether we take an electronic bike, whether we take shared mobility like Uber and Grab. And what all of these do is they amount into multimodal transportation. Using different modes of transport to get around in an urban city, or even integrating different modes into one single trip. And with multimodal transportation will come a decreased importance of car ownership. Now, of course, in some cities, cars are still essential, right? Even I recognize that. But as cities become more apt to multimodal transportation, there's going to be a decreased importance of car ownership. And building upon that comes the next trend of the future: infrastructure and city planning. And the main objective of this is to allow frictionless mobility and encourage multimodal transportation. Cities should be built to allow people to get around how they want to. Simple things like building a bus stop right next to the train station, or having every neighborhood with a shared bike outlet or a shared bike system will allow frictionless mobility to become a reality. Now, the next trend of the future is the integration of technology. Now, we've already seen over the past 10 years, that technology has become so critical to mobility, especially in urban cities. However, what we've seen is really only an indication of how mobility can be drastically improved by technology. Now, we've seen it in industries like banking, the computer industry, even healthcare, but mobility relatively doesn't seem to have adopted technology as much as it could. Now, Bill Gates said if General Motors had kept up with technology like the computer industry has, we would all be driving $25 cars that got 1,000 miles per gallon. Now, obviously, this is a bit of an exaggeration, right? But technology is really about achieving the maximum potential of mobility. Now, the next trend is probably the most anticipated trend of the future, and this is, or of the past 10 years, and this is electrification. Now, despite all the progress we've had, electric vehicles only make up 2.5% of global new car sales. With that said, there are countries like Norway where 56% of all new car sales are electric vehicles. And this is what cities and countries need to take as an example of the future. And to reach this future possibility, I find there's two main factors that cities and countries alike need to implement: the incentivizing of electric vehicles and providing infrastructure. Now, China, over the past few years, has incentivized the production and sale of electric vehicles, and because of that, over 60% of all electric vehicles are in China. What Amsterdam does is every person or every citizen that buys an electric vehicle will be provided with a free charging outlet. Now, granted, there are costs to organizations and governments, but these are costs that in the long term will benefit virtually everyone. Now, the last of these trends, of the 5 game changers of future mobility, is autonomous vehicles. Now, we've seen all the talk in the media, right? In 2020, you'll be a permanent backseat driver. Or by 2020, 10 million self-driving cars will be on the road. Now, clearly this hasn't happened, but there is a reason for that. Autonomous vehicles arguably have the most restraining factors. And this brings up the question, are they really necessary? Do we really need autonomous vehicles? I mean, after all, they're not really taking away cars, are they? But the answer is yes. Autonomous vehicles go beyond simply self-driving cars. They have the ability to connect. Connectivity is really what sets apart autonomous vehicles. Whether it's connecting to infrastructure, whether it's connecting to devices, or whether it's connecting to other vehicles themselves. And with this connectivity comes an enhanced ability to make decisions. As we move into the future, there's numerous things that organizations, governments, companies, that they need to do. But what's our role as consumers? How do we move forward as the future of urban mobility unfolds? Now, in my opinion, the number one factor that we need to do, and probably the most controversial factor as well, is to rethink car ownership. Now, this doesn't mean reducing cars overall. Shared mobility like Uber and Grab, Lyft, Gojek will continue to grow, but do we really need cars for ourselves? The second thing we need to do as consumers, as we move into the future, is to encourage and really adopt multimodal transportation. And this kind of comes with rethinking car ownership. Maybe taking the next time you go to school, maybe taking a bike instead of having your parents drop you off at school, or next time you go to work, instead of driving to school, taking the bus or the MRT. And of course, this isn't all possible today in most cities. But as we move into the future, these options will become more and more realistic. And these are the things that we need to do to propel mobility into the future. And with that, I'd like to leave you with one question. What does it mean to be working in urban mobility in 10 years? Thank you.